Hello and welcome to Talbott Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Today we're in the nursery room of our church because last month we had a special happening, the birth of a new baby to our congregation. Her name is Anna Reese, and we so look forward to the day that she can come and be with us here in the nursery.
Anna Reese is a lucky baby to be born into such a loving family with a big sister Clara anticipating her arrival. She's settling in quite nicely. As you can see, she is very, very cute. Each of us have a unique birth story, and children are fascinated to hear the stories of the events surrounding their birth.
I remember hearing this story from my siblings about when I was born. It seems that my mother, the day before I was born, she fainted in the front yard, and my father was so concerned that he literally leapt over the railing of the front porch to attend to her. Now it turned out that her blood sugar was a little bit low, but everything was fine, and I was born safely. And within a few days, they brought me home, where I was welcomed by my 3 older siblings.
My mother tells me I was born after 14 hours of labor. By the time I got here, everyone was exhausted. But I was the first grandchild born on both sides of the family, so I know I got a lot of grandparent attention.
For some of our parents, the process of conceiving and giving birth was an easy one. But for many parents, it's a very difficult process, and the whole birthing process can be quite harrowing.
We're going to look at a scripture story about Abraham and Sarah today, and the challenges that they experienced, but also the wonderful joy, the surprising joy that they encountered.
I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene, and wonder holding on me, a sinner condemned unclean. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. For me it was in the garden, He prayed not my will but thine. He had no tears for His own griefs, but sweat drops of blood for mine. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me.
Family life brings many joys and challenges to our lives. Here in the month of June, between Mother's Day and Father's Day, we reflect a lot on the roles of our parents in our lives. There are many joys that occur with having children.
Listen as our church members reflect about the joys that they had in raising children.
I have 2 sons, and I just love to see them have fun together. They were a few years apart, but they really enjoyed each other and enjoy each other more today. But our vacations and our trips to the lake, boating, and just to see them have a good time and a good time together.
Watching them grow and learn.
I just loved it. I really did. The kids learning to do things for themselves and the joy that they had.
Come to the house and play around and go to the pond and ride around in the golf cart and 4-wheelers. It's just fun to watch them enjoying life.
Pool parties, having kids over and playing and doing kinds of things like that.
Going camping and fishing, we did that a lot. We went to Ocala National Forest a lot.
And of course the snuggling.
It's just proud that you can raise children, and the youngest one's 59 and the oldest one's 67.
This morning we're going to reflect on a story in the beginning of the book of Genesis, from Genesis 18, where Abraham and Sarah were in their tent, and it was a very hot day. In fact, during the hottest part of the day, Abraham notices 3 messengers, and he runs out from his tent to greet them, and he bows down before them, and he welcomes them. Now, this was an important thing, to offer hospitality to visitors. It was one way to be connected to the other people that were in the community. It was the way to hear the news of what was happening in nearby places. Or he could have also recognized that these were divine visitors. Now, he may not have known this at the very beginning, but by the end of his visit, he certainly knew this. And so he welcomed them. He brought them under the shade of one of his trees, and then he ran into his wife and he said, "Sarah, get your finest flour and prepare food." And he went and killed some meat, a calf, and had that prepared and roasted. And then he offered all of this food, the bread, the meat, the yogurt, and he waited.
The messenger queries, "Where's your wife?" And Abraham responds, "Inside the tent." Now, if you've ever been camping, you know that inside the tent and outside the tent, there's not much privacy. You can hear everything that's going on outside the tent. And so perhaps the messenger wanted Sarah to be able to hear this promise that was going to be given. Remember that Abraham had heard this promise from the Lord 3 times, but Sarah hadn't. And so this was an opportunity for Sarah to hear the promise. In Genesis, the 18th chapter, it says, "I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son."
The Bible tells us that Sarah laughed to herself. Now, why would she chuckle? Have you ever had great hopes that something would happen? Maybe somebody promised you something and you waited and you hoped and you waited and you waited. You know, Sarah and Abraham had a long journey, a long road together. Their story begins several chapters back in chapter 11, where there's a genealogy of Abraham's family, and his father Terah describes the children and Abram's cousins, and there Sarah is first introduced, where it says, Sarah was not able to have children. This is how she was introduced. This was her defining feature. And only 2 verses later, in the beginning of chapter 12, God says to Abram, "I will cause you to become the father of a great nation." The stage is set for an interesting story. Here, Sarah is barren, which is actually the worst fate that a woman could have at that time, because for a woman, her value was found in her ability to bear sons. And then Abram is promised that he would be the father of many nations. When you tie the wedding knot, you know that you're in it together through all of the ups and downs of life, through the adventures and adversity, through the victories and the calamities.
The story of Abraham and Sarah is one of faithfulness, of steadfastness through challenges and trials. Today we're going to look at some elements of that story, so we'll jet through this story. It begins in Ur of the Chaldees. This is a map of the journey of Abraham. Abraham leaves Ur of the Chaldees and he travels down to the land of Canaan, to a place near Shechem, to a grove of oak trees known as Morah. And there, in this place that was sacred to the Canaanites, it was a shrine to the Canaanites, God meets him at that place. And God speaks to him in Genesis 16. It says, "I'm going to give this land to your offspring." And Abraham builds an altar there, and he dedicates it to the Lord. There at that site of pagan worship, Abraham begins to build this relationship with the Lord.
This next chapter of their lives together is very interesting. There comes a famine, and so as they're traveling, they decide to go to Egypt for safety and for food. And before they go, Abram says to Sarai, "Now, when you get there, tell Pharaoh, tell everyone that you're my sister." Now, this is Sarai's second defining characteristic. Her first defining characteristic was that she's barren. And now her second defining characteristic is that she's beautiful. And so he's to tell, and they're to tell everybody that She is his sister. And so, of course, when they get to Egypt, people notice how beautiful she is, and they take her up to Pharaoh's household. And in exchange, Abram receives sheep and cattle and donkeys and camels and male and female servants. And probably Hagar was among this group. And everything is going well until these plagues hit Pharaoh and his household. And so he calls Abram in and he says, "What have you done?" And it's revealed that in truth, Sarai is Abram's wife. And so the Pharaoh sends Abram out with all his household, all his goods, under an armed escort. Out they go. And so they continue on their journey, and you can see on the map, now they're heading north. They headed to the Negev between Bethel and Ai. There they settled with his nephew Lot and all their herdsmen. And in time, there were conflicts that arose between the herdsmen about where they could graze their sheep and their cattle. And so Abram gave Lot the choice of where to settle. And Lot took the beautiful valleys of the Jordan. But in time, there were wars that came and erupted, and Lot was taken captive. And so Abram, in order to free him, gathered up 318 of his people, and they went to battle. And they won, and they were able to get Lot back. And then an interesting person appears, this King Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was a priest of the Canaanites. And he came and he blessed Abram, but in God's name. It's interesting, Melchizedek is reflected upon in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 7:1 says, "This Melchizedek was king of the city of Salem and also a priest of God Most High. His name means king of righteousness, suggesting that he was a righteous servant of God, and he blessed Abram."
The story continues, and God speaks to Abram in a vision. In Genesis 15, God says, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." But Abraham replied, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since I don't have a son, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth." This is an interesting dynamic. Who is this Eliezer? Well, obviously he's a trusted servant of Abram and Sarai. And as they aged, they needed somebody who would take care of them, somebody to make burial arrangements for them after they died. And this Eliezer was adopted to do these tasks. And so all of Abram's wealth, all of his savings and his property, his land, that would revert then to Eliezer. But in Genesis 15, God says this, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own to inherit everything I am giving to you." And then God takes Abram outside of the tent and has him look into the night sky. And he sees the Milky Way and all of the stars. And then God says to him in chapter 15 of Genesis, "Look up into the heavens and count the stars if you can. Your descendants will be like that, too many to count." God tells Abram about his descendants, that one day they will be strangers in a foreign land, that they will be oppressed for many years. But one day they will be freed and have new prosperity.
But still, Sarai has no children. And so she takes her servant Hagar, and she says, "Maybe I can have children through her." And she discusses this with Abram, and he agrees that it's a good idea. And so Hagar gets pregnant, but then she resents Sarai, and she runs away, and she goes and she finds a little wellspring, and there she's crying out, and then an angel encounters her and says to her, "Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you been and where are you going?" And so Hagar explains her situation, how she is so unhappy, and yet the angel tells her to return and to be submissive to her master, but then gives her this wonderful promise. "I will give you more descendants than you can count." It's interesting in this story that God also took notice of Hagar, The scriptures say, "Thereafter Hagar referred to the Lord who had spoken to her as the God who sees me. For she said, 'I have seen the one who sees me.'" Hagar bears a son named Ishmael, and 13 years later, God reappears to Abram and makes another promise. "I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Serve me faithfully and live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you, by which I will guarantee to give you countless descendants. I will make you the father of a multitude of nations." And then God changes Abram's name to Abraham. Abram meant high and honored father, and now Abraham means father of many nations. And God establishes with Abraham a covenant and the rite of circumcision to set these people apart. And then toward the end of the chapter, God changes Sarai's name as well. Sarai meant princess, but Sarah, her new name, means queen or chieftain. And God promised that she would be the mother of many nations. But Abraham, it says in the scriptures, Abraham bowed down to the ground, but he laughed to himself in disbelief. He responds, "Yes, may Ishmael receive your special blessing." But God responds in turn, "Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. You will name him Isaac, and I will confirm my everlasting covenant with him and his descendants. As for Ishmael, I will bless him also, just as you have asked." Abraham laughed on hearing this news. They had been through so many ups and downs.
The messengers leave for Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham then heads south to the Negev. And he does it again. He introduces his beautiful wife as his sister, and then King Abimelech, the king there, takes Sarah into his courts. But before they can be together, he has a dream, and in the dream, he realizes that he is condemned because he's with another man's wife. So when he wakes in the morning, he confronts Abraham. And Abraham tries to explain things to him. He says, "Well, Sarah is actually my sister, my half-sister. We have different mothers, but the same father." It's very complicated relationships. Well, the king is furious, and so he tells Sarah this, "Look, I'm giving your brother 1,000 pieces of silver in the presence of all these witnesses. This is to compensate you for any wrong I have done. This will settle any claim against me, and your reputation is cleared." And so now we move towards the end of the story. It says in chapter 21, "The Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. And Sarah declared, 'God has brought me laughter.'" What a marvelous story.
These two people, Abraham and Sarah, the patriarch and matriarch of our faith, they're held up in Hebrews 11 and Romans 4 as models of faith for us. And yet, they certainly had a circuitous journey. Sometimes they struggled to believe that what God promised would come true. Sometimes they even laughed at God and wondered what God was doing.
They tried for decades to have a child. Decades. They waited and waited on the hope for promise, and then they tried another path. I suppose we can understand that. I suppose in some ways that makes sense. But God's promise, his steadfast love and commitment, although it takes patience, there is an immense joy that comes when we wait for God's unfolding promise.
The story of the Bible reminds us over and over again that our God is a God who sees us. The messenger, in responding to Sarah's laughter, said, "Is anything too hard for God?" With joy, Abraham and Sarah received their answer to that question. May it be so in our lives as well.
Christ our